Atlantis is the focus of a brief yet significant article found in the annual report of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution from the early 20th century. The piece features insights from Pierre Termier, a distinguished member of the French Academy of Sciences and director of the Geological Chart of France. A few years earlier, he had delivered a notable lecture on the theory of Atlantis at the Institut Oceanographique, and the Smithsonian publication includes the translated version of that presentation. Termier observed that, after a prolonged period during which the idea of Atlantis was largely dismissed, the scientific community had begun to re-examine the subject with renewed interest. Researchers across various disciplines, natural history, geology, zoology, and botany, had started to ask whether Plato's account, though likely embellished, might in fact preserve a fragment of genuine human history. While no firm conclusions could yet be drawn, there appeared to be growing support for the idea that a large landmass, possibly a continent or a cluster of major islands, had once existed beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, also known as the Pillars of Hercules, and that this land had vanished within a relatively recent geological period. The topic, once disregarded, was now again under scientific scrutiny. Termier emphasized that any serious inquiry into Atlantis would inevitably depend on oceanographic research, which made it especially appropriate to discuss such a subject in the very institution dedicated to maritime science. He aimed to draw the attention of both oceanographers and thoughtful minds who, even amidst the noise of modern life, remained attuned to the deeper echoes of the sea. In his lecture, Termier brought forward geological, geographical, and zoological observations to support the possibility of Atlantis's existence. Imagining the Atlantic Ocean floor laid bare, he explored the uneven features of its basin and pointed to regions stretching from the Azores to Iceland where deep-sea dredging had revealed volcanic rock from remarkable depths. The volcanic origins of the Atlantic islands lent credibility to Plato's claim that Atlantis was destroyed by fiery upheavals. Additionally, Termier referenced the work of a young French zoologist, Louis Germain, who had proposed that there had once been a landmass in the Atlantic that linked the Iberian Peninsula with parts of North Africa, extending southward into arid regions. Termier concluded with a vivid description of the cataclysm that may have swallowed this lost world beneath the waves. Plato's account of Atlantis, as told in the Critias, outlines a vision of an ancient and highly developed civilization. In the earliest times, the gods are said to have divided the earth among themselves, each taking possession of a region corresponding to their status. Within these domains, they established their own cults, appointed priests, and instituted rituals and offerings in their honor. Poseidon, god of the sea, received as his share a vast island continent surrounded by ocean. At the heart of this land was a mountain, home to a trio of original human beings born from the earth, Evener, his wife Leucippe, and their daughter Cleito. After the parents passed away, Cleito, described as strikingly beautiful, was approached by Poseidon, who united with her and fathered 10 sons in pairs. To each son he granted a portion of the island, but the firstborn, Atlas, was made supreme among them. The land was named Atlantis, and the sea encircling it was likewise named in Atlas's honor. Before his sons were born, Poseidon reshaped the landscape around the central mountain, forming alternating rings of land and water in a perfect circular design, as though crafted with mechanical precision. These rings consisted of 2 belts of land and 3 of water, surrounding the central island. To nourish this area, Poseidon caused 2 springs to flow, one of warm water and the other cold. Atlas's descendants continued to govern Atlantis, and under their guidance the civilization flourished. The land produced an extraordinary wealth of natural resources. Mines yielded valuable metals, wild creatures were tamed, and fragrant plants were used to produce perfumes. Benefiting from a mild and abundant climate, the people constructed grand buildings, sacred temples, and harbors. They spanned the rings of water with bridges, and eventually dug a wide canal to link the outer sea with the central island, where the grand palace and temple of Poseidon stood, surpassing all others in beauty and scale. The Atlanteans developed an elaborate system of waterways and bridges to connect every region of their domain. Plato goes on to describe the stones, white, black, and red, which were extracted from beneath the land and used to build the public works and waterfronts. Each ring of land was encircled by a wall, with the outermost clad in bronze, the middle in tin, and the innermost, enclosing the fortress, covered in a metal called orichalk. The stronghold on the central island housed the most important structures, including palaces, shrines, and other civic buildings. At its center was a sacred enclosure honoring Clito and Poseidon, where the original 10 rulers had been born. Their descendants returned there each year with offerings. Poseidon's temple, located within this fortified area, was entirely overlaid in silver on the outside, with golden spires. The interior gleamed with ivory, silver, gold, and orichalk, which adorned even the columns and floors. Inside stood a massive sculpture of Poseidon, riding a chariot drawn by winged horses, surrounded by sea nymphs mounted on dolphins. Positioned outside the temple were golden statues representing the 10 founding kings and their consorts. Throughout the groves and landscaped areas, both warm and cool springs could be found. The land was dotted with sanctuaries dedicated to various gods, areas for athletic training, some for men, others for animals, along with communal bathing facilities and an expansive track designed for chariot racing. Defensive structures were established at key positions along the concentric zones, and the bustling harbor welcomed ships arriving from across the known seafaring world. These zones were so heavily inhabited that the constant murmur of human activity never ceased. The region of Atlantis facing the ocean was marked by high cliffs and steep drops, while the area surrounding the central capital lay within a vast plain enclosed by mountains, famous for their impressive height, great number, and stunning appearance. This plain was remarkably fertile, producing crops twice a year, once from seasonal rainfall and again through an extensive network of irrigation channels, which also served as routes for transporting goods and people. The plain was divided into separate regions, each responsible for supplying soldiers and war chariots in times of conflict. Though united under a shared heritage, each ruler governed his own territory with slight variations in military obligations. The overall alliance among these monarchs was preserved by a code established by their earliest ancestors, inscribed upon a column of orichalk that stood in the sacred precinct of Poseidon. At regularly observed intervals, a ceremonial gathering was held at this temple, honoring all lineages equally. During this rite, each king reaffirmed his vow of unity and allegiance before the ancient inscription, accompanied by solemn offerings. Clothed in robes of deep blue, they assembled to judge disputes and resolve pressing matters. At dawn, each ruler recorded his verdict onto a golden plaque, which was then placed alongside his garments as a lasting record. Among the primary rules upheld by these sovereigns was a commitment never to wage war against one another, and to offer aid whenever one of them faced an enemy. When it came to matters of high consequence, particularly those involving warfare, the final judgment rested with those directly descended from the house of Atlas. No king could condemn his own blood to death without the agreement of the majority. Plato ends his account by stating that it was this mighty civilization that eventually launched an offensive against the Greek world. However, this did not occur until the Atlantean rulers, seduced by their expanding influence and magnificence, strayed from the path of justice and moderation. Driven by reckless ambition, they sought to extend their dominance over the entire earth. Seeing this descent into corruption, Zeus summoned the gods to his sacred dwelling and addressed them in council. At this point, the tale is left incomplete, as the Critias breaks off abruptly. The earlier dialogue, the Timaeus, offers a final detail of the tale, reportedly passed down to Solon by an Egyptian priest. Following these events, powerful floods and tremors shook the earth, and in one catastrophic day and night, all the warriors of Atlantis were swallowed by the land, and the island itself was lost beneath the waves. From that moment on, the sea in that area became unnavigable, filled with thick silt left behind by the island's collapse. In his preface to the Timaeus translation, Thomas Taylor includes a passage drawn from Marcellus's History of Ethiopia, which makes mention of Atlantis in the following way. It is said that, in earlier times, there existed a group of islands in the Atlantic Ocean devoted to Proserpine, and alongside them, 3 others of vast size. One of these was consecrated to Pluto, another to Ammon, and the one in the center, larger than the rest, was sacred to Neptune. Crantor, in his interpretation of Plato's writings, claimed that Egyptian priests maintained the Atlantis account on ancient pillars that remained intact well into the early Hellenistic period. Ignatius Donnelly, who explored the topic of Atlantis in great depth, was of the opinion that it was within this lost civilization that horses were first tamed, which may explain why they held such symbolic importance for the god Poseidon. A thoughtful analysis of Plato's portrayal of Atlantis suggests the tale should not be read as literal history alone, but rather as a blend of factual and symbolic meaning. Ancient thinkers such as Origen, Porphyry, Proclus, Iamblichus, and Syrianus recognized the presence of deep metaphysical teachings hidden within the narrative, although they diverged in how they chose to interpret them. For Plato, Atlantis reflected the triple composition of both the cosmos and the human form. Its line of rulers, described as 10 in number, represented pairs of opposing principles, following the teachings of Pythagorean philosophy, in which all beings are governed by the progression of numbers, and these in turn by the singular unity of the monad, the primal source. Using the trident of Poseidon as their symbol of authority, the kings governed the inhabitants of the smaller sacred isles and the larger territorial divisions. In esoteric terms, the 10 lands signify the combination of divine intelligence manifest in 3 supreme principles and 7 cosmic powers in service of the divine. If one takes Atlantis to represent the ideal or primordial world, then its submergence alludes to the soul's descent from enlightened reason into the fragmented and fleeting state of worldly ignorance. Thus, both the disappearance of Atlantis and the biblical tale of humanity's fall from grace represent the necessary decline into unconsciousness that must precede spiritual awakening. Plato, having been initiated into the mysteries, may have shaped the Atlantis allegory to serve both a literal and a spiritual purpose, or it is possible that the accounts passed down by Egyptian sages had been adjusted to protect esoteric knowledge. This is not to argue that Atlantis is wholly fictional, but rather to resolve the tension surrounding the more exaggerated claims about its origin, scale, and sudden destruction at a point deep in antiquity. At the center of the island stood a towering mountain, immense in height, whose shadow reached across the surrounding lands, and whose peak was said to touch the realm beyond the air. This world axis, known to many ancient cultures, symbolized not only the center of the earth, but also the crown of the human form, emerging from the elemental structure of the body. Atop this sacred mountain was the Temple of the Gods, inspiring the legends of Olympus, Meru, and Asgard. The capital of Atlantis, known as the City of the Golden Gates, survives through religious traditions under names like the Celestial City or the Divine Sanctuary. This ideal metropolis is the pattern for visions of the New Jerusalem, described as a holy city adorned with shining avenues and gateways of radiant gems. Ignatius Donnelly wrote that the mythology of the Greeks finds its true origin in the saga of Atlantis. He insisted that the gods of old were, in fact, once mortal men, elevated by collective memory into divinity, a tendency that seems rooted in the very nature of humanity. The same writer supports his interpretation by observing that the gods of the Greek tradition were not regarded as the creators of the cosmos, but rather as stewards appointed by more ancient, original architects. The story of the Garden of Eden, guarded by a sword of flame and barring humanity's return, may allude to a once sacred earthly paradise thought to lie west of the Pillars of Hercules, later destroyed by cataclysmic volcanic upheaval. The tale of a great flood can also be traced back to the submergence of Atlantis, during which an entire age or civilization was swept away beneath the waters. One may ask whether the sacred, philosophical, and scientific understanding possessed by the priesthoods of the ancient world had its origins in Atlantis, whose disappearance erased the physical record of its contributions to early civilization. The solar veneration of the Atlanteans seems to have continued in the liturgical forms of both ancient pagan faiths and early Christianity. Emblems such as the cross and the serpent, long revered for their esoteric meaning, were among the sacred symbols of Atlantean wisdom. The divine ancestors of the Mayan and Quiche peoples were believed to have moved within the glowing brilliance of Gucumatz, the feathered serpent. From the heavens descended a company of enlightened sages, each a point of radiance, unified by a guiding force symbolized by the great winged snake, who held the highest rank among them. The title of plumed serpent was bestowed upon figures such as Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan, initiated teachers of Central America. At the heart of the Atlantean mystery tradition stood, it is believed, a monumental temple in pyramid form, placed upon a high plateau at the center of the fabled city of the Golden Gates. From this sanctuary, the bearers of the sacred feather are said to have journeyed outward, bringing the hidden truths of the universe to distant lands. In the lore of various cultures are stories of deities who emerged from the sea. Some Native American traditions speak of wise figures clothed in feathers and decorated with sacred beads who rose from the depths and taught the people practical skills and spiritual truths. In the legends of the Chaldeans, one finds the being Oans, part human, part aquatic, who came ashore to instruct the early tribes in literacy, agriculture, herbal medicine, celestial observation, governance, and the higher mysteries of existence. Within the beliefs of the Mayan people, Quetzalcoatl, a redeemer figure, sometimes equated with the Christian apostle Thomas, also emerged from the sea. After sharing knowledge of civilization, he departed upon a mystical vessel fashioned of serpents, evading the vengeance of the formidable deity of the burning mirror, Tezcatlipoca. Might it be that these half-divine teachers of ancient legend, who surfaced from the ocean like the prophet Esdras, were actually Atlantean sages? The earliest peoples remembered only the splendor of their golden adornments, the vastness of their understanding, and the sanctity of their symbols, the cross and the serpent. That they had arrived in ships was soon forgotten, for to the unlettered, even boats appeared otherworldly. Wherever the Atlanteans spread their teachings, they built sacred monuments and sanctuaries modeled after the great temple in their capital. The pyramids of Egypt, Mexico, and Central America have their roots in this architectural tradition. The great mounds of Normandy and the British Isles, as well as the earthworks of indigenous American cultures, all echo the same origin. In the midst of their efforts to spread wisdom and build centers of learning across the world, the catastrophe that drowned Atlantis began. The teachers of the sacred feather, who had once promised to return to their distant colonies, vanished with their homeland. Over the centuries, only fragmented myths remained, stories of radiant beings who came from a place now swallowed by the sea. H. P. Blavatsky describes the downfall of Atlantis as being brought about by the moral corruption of its people. Led astray by the influence of a dark entity named Thevatat, the Atlanteans turned into a civilization dominated by black magic and sorcery. This degeneration sparked a great conflict, the details of which are too extensive to recount fully, though echoes of it survive in altered symbolic narratives, such as those involving the descendants of Cain, the ancient giants, and the biblical account of Noah and his family. The war ended with the engulfing of Atlantis by the ocean, a cataclysm reflected in the tales of great floods found in Babylonian and Hebrew traditions. The mighty magicians and their followers perished, as did nearly all of humankind, with only a few, represented in stories by figures like Xisuthros and Noah, surviving. These characters bear resemblance to the primordial ancestor in the sacred lore of the Tlinkithians and the Mayan Popol Vuh, which recounts a great flood and the survival of a chosen one in a large vessel, a theme also found in the Hindu tale of Vaiswasvata. From the Atlantean legacy, humanity inherited not only the foundations of craftsmanship, philosophical thought, sacred teachings, and religious traditions, but also the seeds of conflict, distortion, and moral decay. According to tradition, it was the Atlanteans who waged the first war, and every conflict since has been an unconscious attempt to resolve that original injustice and restore the balance it disrupted. Before the deluge claimed their homeland, the enlightened among the Atlanteans, those who foresaw the coming disaster and remained loyal to the spiritual path, departed from the sinking land. With them they carried the secret doctrine, and many of these initiates journeyed to Egypt, where they became its earliest revered rulers. Much of the symbolic mythology forming the spiritual foundations of the world's religious texts is thought to be derived from the esoteric rituals once practiced in Atlantis. One of the earliest instances of the dying and rising god motif is found in the story of Tammuz and Ishtar, an allegory that may have roots deeper than the earliest known civilizations. The fragmented state of the tablets on which these myths are recorded prevents a complete reconstruction of the Tammuz rites, yet enough survives to reveal that Tammuz, originally a solar deity, was later viewed more simply as a god of fertility or a spirit of the harvest, his true role having faded from popular memory. He is also described as one of the watchers at the gates of the underworld and, like many solar redeemers, was known as a shepherd or as the lord of a divine seat. In the myth, he is both the consort and the child of Ishtar, the great mother of the Babylonian and Assyrian religions, whose worship was widespread. She was linked with the planet Venus and closely associated with goddesses such as Ashtaroth, Astarte, and Aphrodite. The account of her descent into the realm of the dead in search of a mystical essence that could bring Tammuz back to life holds the central mystery of her sacred rites. Tammuz is said to have died during the height of summer, in a season that later came to bear his name, and his death was marked by public lamentation. Though the exact cause of his demise remains unclear, some of the charges brought against Ishtar by Izdubar, identified by some with Nimrod, suggest she may have played a role in his fate. His eventual return from death became a cause for celebration, during which he was honored as a liberator or spiritual savior of his people. With wings extended, Ishtar, daughter of the moon god Sin, descends swiftly to the gates of the realm of death. This shadowy place, ruled by the deity Ercalla, is portrayed as a domain from which there is no return. Darkness pervades this realm. Those who inhabit it feed upon dust, and their drink is mire. The very bolts of Ercalla's gate are strewn with ash, and its wardens are shrouded in feathers, resembling ghostly birds. Ishtar demands entrance, warning that if denied, she will tear down the doors, break the bars, and unleash the dead to consume the living. The gatekeepers plead with her to wait as they seek permission from the queen of the underworld, who consents, though only on condition that Ishtar enter as any other soul must. Thus begins her journey downward, through the gates that separate the world of the living from the region below. At each gate something of her is taken: the diadem from her brow, the adornments of her ears, the chain from her throat, the jewels from her chest, the belt from her middle, the bangles from her limbs, and finally, the veil from her body. With each step, Ishtar protests, but the guardians remind her that this path strips all who walk it. Once within the gloomy domain, the Lady of the Dead, enraged by Ishtar's presence, afflicts her with grievous ailments and holds her captive. Since Ishtar embodies growth and generative power, her absence from the world above brings a halt to the blooming of plants and the unfolding of all living things. In this sense, her tale mirrors that of Persephone, whose descent also disrupts the harmony of nature. Alarmed by the disorder her disappearance brings, the deities send an emissary to the lower realm, demanding her release. The ruler of the underworld relents, and Ishtar is revived by the pouring of the water of renewal upon her. Restored from the afflictions imposed upon her, she retraces her passage upward, reclaiming at each gate the symbols and garments of her lost splendor. Though Ishtar returns, no account tells of her acquiring the elixir needed to restore Tammuz to life. This myth echoes the journey of the soul through the celestial spheres, gradually descending into the material world. As it passes through each level, it is stripped of its spiritual essence, until finally it becomes bound in the body, its tomb, where it suffers under the dominion of the physical. The healing waters, symbolic of hidden wisdom, lift the soul from ignorance, and it begins the ascent back to its divine origin, reclaiming its inner light as it moves once more through the planetary spheres toward unity with the Source. Among the sacred rites practiced by the Babylonians and Assyrians, one involved the tale of Merodach and a fearsome serpent. Merodach, regarded as the architect of the lesser world, engages in battle with a monstrous being. Upon conquering the beast, he uses its broken form to shape the cosmos. This myth appears to be an early source for the later tale in which a noble figure slays a dragon, much like the familiar story of a saint defeating such a creature. The sacred observances dedicated to Adonis, also known as Adoni, were held yearly across regions such as Egypt, Phoenicia, and Byblos. The name itself means Lord, and was used to identify the solar force, later adapted by the Hebrews as a surface title for their deity. His mother, known as Smyrna, was transformed by the divine into a tree, and in time the bark split open to reveal the divine child. One version recounts how a wild boar tore the tree with its tusks, freeing the newborn. He entered the world at the turning of winter, and through his tragic demise a mystery tradition arose that offered redemption to his followers. In the season linked with his name, the god fell under the tusks of a boar, a creature sent by a martial divinity. The ritual mourning of his untimely death became a central component of the Adonis rites. A passage in a prophetic text mentions women lamenting for this solar god at the northern threshold of the sacred place in Jerusalem. A later source quotes a church father who wrote that the town remembered as the birthplace of the Christian Saviour once hosted a grove sacred to the older deity Adonis. He claimed that the place where the child Christ had once shed tears was previously a site of mourning for Venus's beloved. An image of the boar was supposedly displayed over one of the gates of Jerusalem in his honor, and ceremonies in his name took place in a cavern near Bethlehem. The wounded deity, his very name possibly meaning pierced one, offered inspiration to cryptic symbolism that associated the wild boar with divine suffering. Originally, Adonis was portrayed as both male and female, embodying the sun's power that perished in winter under the force of the frigid, destructive principle symbolized by the boar. After remaining entombed for a span of time, he rose again at the dawn of spring, to the joyous cries of those who served him, a proclamation of resurrection. His birth from the myrrh tree, myrrh being a funereal resin tied to the rites of embalming, adds symbolic depth, especially since this substance also appears among the gifts presented to a sacred child in later tradition. In the Adonis mysteries, initiates experienced a ritual death reflecting that of the god and, through the priest's symbolic raising, were brought into a state of blessed renewal made possible by his sorrow. Many scholars identify Adonis as an early vegetation deity whose essence was tied to the sprouting and ripening of plant life. They point to the gardens of Adonis, earthen containers filled with seeded soil, cultivated for a brief time. When the plants wilted and died for want of deeper roots, their decline was seen as mirroring the slain god and were often cast into the sea alongside his images. In the land of Phrygia, there flourished a distinct tradition of spiritual thought centered on the story and destiny of a divine figure known as Athes or Attis, often regarded as another form of the god Adonis. This being was said to have been born in the stillness of a wintry night. His death is recounted in two distinct traditions. In one, he is slain by the tusks of a wild beast. In the other, he takes his own life in a fit of divine frenzy beneath a pine tree, rendering himself incapable of creation. His lifeless form was carried away by the Great Mother, Cybele, and placed in a sacred cavern, where it was said to rest through the ages without succumbing to decay. The customs associated with Athes are believed to be the origin of the tree, now adorned in midwinter celebration. His death sanctified the pine tree beneath which he fell, and the mother carried it away alongside his body. Athes passed through death and reappeared after a period of concealment, a return that symbolized victory over mortality for all who were accepted into his sacred tradition. Julius Firmicus writes that in the holy rites of the Phrygians, which honored the mother of the gods, a pine tree was felled each year, and within it the likeness of a young man was bound. In the sacred drama of Isis, a pine's trunk was hollowed, and from its inner wood, the image of Osiris was shaped and then buried. Within the rites of Proserpine, another tree was prepared and arranged to form the semblance of a maiden. This effigy was paraded through the city and lamented for many nights, until on the final evening it was committed to flame. These variations across cults reflect a shared motif of nature, death, and rebirth expressed through the tree and divine figure. The rituals of Athes also included a ceremonial meal wherein the participant consumed food from a drum and drank from a cymbal. The initiate would undergo a form of baptism in the blood of a sacrificial bull, and afterward live only on milk, signifying his emergence into a new state of being, not yet mature in spiritual matters. Some have drawn a connection between this symbolic nourishment and the references in Christian scripture to those new to spiritual understanding being fed as infants. According to Sallust, a deeper layer of meaning lies within the narrative. Cybele represents the life-giving forces of the cosmos, while Athes reflects the soul's higher faculty, caught between its divine source and its lower, worldly nature. The Great Mother, in her devotion to Athes, granted him a crown of stars, emblem of heavenly gifts, but when Athes, representing humanity, turned toward a nymph symbolizing earthly desires, he lost this divine status and his generative strength. The drama thus becomes an allegory for human consciousness, and the path back to divine favor through purification and enlightenment. The worship of Sabazius bore strong resemblance to that of Bacchus, with many considering the two gods to be essentially the same. Bacchus was said to have been born at a place bearing the name of Sabazius or Sabaoth, both of which were later attributed to him. The rites of Sabazius were conducted beneath the veil of night, and included a striking act in which a living serpent was drawn across the chest of the initiate. Clement of Alexandria notes that the sign of this initiation was the divine serpent passing over the body. The golden snake served as the emblem of Sabazius, embodying the cyclical renewal of the world through the force of the sun. From these ceremonies, the name Sabaoth was later taken up by the Hebrew tradition and used as a sacred title for the divine. While this cult once held strong influence in the city of Rome, gathering many followers, it eventually left its mark upon the symbols later adopted into Christian rites. The sacred rites known as the Kabiric mysteries, practiced on the island of Samothrace, held great reverence in antiquity, standing just below the famed Eleusinian ceremonies in regard and influence. According to Herodotus, the Samothracians inherited much of their religious doctrine, especially the teachings related to the god Hermes, from the ancient Pelasgians. Although these rites were carefully guarded and little survives of their exact procedures, fragments suggest that the central figures known as the Cabiri were sometimes considered a divine group linked to fire and cosmic order, often described as spirits in service before the throne of Saturn. Others associated them with the wandering celestial bodies later known as planets. Despite the presence of many deities within these ceremonies, the narrative focus of the rituals lies in the actions of four divine brothers. The first three, Askyros, Achiochersus, and Achiochersa, are said to have slain their sibling Kashmela, also referred to as Cadmilus. Interpretations vary, with one suggesting that these names are symbolic: Askyros as Demeter, Achiochersus as Pluto, Achiochersa as Persephone, and Kashmela as Hermes. Alexander Wilder explains that Cadmilus embodies a fusion of several mythological and spiritual figures: the Theban serpent god Cadmus, the Egyptian Thoth, the Greek Hermes, and the healing deity known in Alexandrian and Phoenician tradition. This tale reflects the universal myth of the suffering and slain god, present in many traditions including Osiris, Bacchus, Adonis, Balder, and Hiram. The cult of Athes and the goddess Cybele also appears to have influenced the Kabiric tradition, as within its rites, a pine tree, sacred to Athes, was shaped into the form of a cross and then felled in honor of the god whose remains were discovered lying beneath it. Clement of Alexandria, writing critically of these rites, described an event in which the third of the Corybantic brothers was killed, his head veiled in purple and crowned, and his body carried upon a spear to be buried beneath Mount Olympus. He interpreted the ritual as a ceremonial enactment of murder and mourning. Clement also noted peculiar restrictions imposed by the priests, styled as kings of the sacred order, including a prohibition against placing parsley with roots on the table, as it was believed to have sprung from the blood of the slain brother. This echoed a similar practice among women observing the Thesmophoria, who avoided eating fallen pomegranate seeds out of reverence for the belief that they arose from the blood of Dionysus. The Corybants were also linked to the Cabiri, and the rite itself was often referred to as the Kabiric mystery. The ritual process was divided into progressive stages. In the initial stage, the story of Kashmela's death at the hands of his brothers was commemorated. The second stage focused on the gathering of his dismembered remains after a long and sorrowful search. The final stage, marked by celebration, involved his return from death, an event that symbolized the redemption of the world. Within the Temple of the Cabri stood a collection of unusual and sometimes grotesque deities, thought to embody the primal forces of nature and possibly connected to the titans of Bacchic lore. Initiation into these mysteries was open to all ages, and even those fleeing justice could find safety within the temple grounds. A notable aspect of the Samothracian religion was its link to seafaring, with Castor and Pollux, the twin patrons of navigation, revered among its honored figures. The famed expedition of the Argonauts, heeding the guidance of Orpheus, made a deliberate stop on the island to undergo initiation into the Cabiric rites before continuing their voyage. Herodotus recounts an episode in which Cambyses, upon entering the temple dedicated to the Cabri, was overtaken by laughter at the sight of two curious figures. One, a man positioned upright, and across from him, a woman inverted, standing on her head. Yet had Cambyses understood the deeper principles of celestial symbolism, he might have recognized in this peculiar imagery the hidden law of balance that governs all things. Voltaire once posed a probing question about these enigmatic priests, these guardians of arcane rites, asking who they truly were, these initiates of the Samothracian mysteries, and from what lands their gods, the Cabri, had originated. Clement of Alexandria refers to their rites as a sacred mystery, centered on a brother slain by his kin. This symbolic death, known as the Cabiric death, was long preserved as a concealed emblem in ancient thought. It reflects a recurring mystical theme, the inner self, sacrificed by its worldly counterpart. This same duality is mirrored in countless spiritual traditions. Within this symbolic framework, the path of initiation proceeds from the lesser rite of death to the greater rite of renewal and rebirth. Among the variations of this archetype is the image of the hanged man, which stands out with unique prominence in the Nordic rituals honoring Odin. In one of the most dramatic expressions of divine sacrifice, Odin suspends himself from the limbs of the cosmic tree, and in this state of voluntary suffering, he drives a spear into his own side. This act of self-offering continues over several nights, during which he remains poised above the dark realm of Niflheim. Through this ordeal, Odin attains insight, gaining knowledge of the runes, the sacred letters that would become the foundation for preserving the wisdom of his people. Because of this sacred event, Odin is sometimes depicted atop the gallows tree, and he came to be revered as the spiritual protector of all those who met their end by hanging. In the esoteric sense, the hanged man signifies the human soul, suspended by a solitary thread from the heavens. This is not a symbol of destruction, but of transformation. Through this suspended state, above the illusions of the world, the soul contemplates what lies beyond appearances, and in so doing, arrives at its own inner awakening. When all of these secret and ancient traditions are considered together, a single powerful theme emerges, the myth of the divine being who dies. This symbol appears across the sacred teachings of many enlightened schools, always pointing toward a hidden truth. The Christian narrative of the suffering and crucified Christ continues this sacred pattern. The deeper spiritual meaning behind this cosmic event, the sacrifice of the divine figure, is essential if the Christian tradition is to ascend once more to the philosophical clarity achieved by earlier civilizations. For within this archetypal myth lies the key not only to humanity's redemption on a universal scale, but to the individual's rebirth as well. Without understanding the genuine significance of this highest mystery, one cannot rightfully claim either wisdom or true spirituality.